It sounds kind of pedantic. It sounds, like you're being too micromanagey on it. It's not. This is actually helping people to hit the ground running, right? So that,
But you're creating a habit building loop,
yeah,
and you're allowing people to act their way into new mindsets. So they're gonna learn these new behaviors. Welcome to the CX and Culture Connection, the podcast for CX leaders who are looking to accelerate value from investing in customer experience and culture together. Today, I'm joined by Chris Taylor, who's the founder and CEO of Actionable. They're a really innovative company that I enjoy working with to help drive motivation and commitment to change as you invest in your customer journey, your journey to be more customer driven. So really looking forward to our conversation today. Chris, thanks for joining.
yeah, it's my pleasure, Matt. Thanks for having me on the show.
Awesome. Well, just to get going, maybe share a little bit more about Actionable and what inspired you to launch the company.
Absolutely. I've been obsessed, Matt, with the process of translating information into action, or process, depending on which side of the border you're on. I'm in Canada. I started this way early on in my career. I was doing sales and then sales management, and I became really fascinated with. I would teach or would bring in external trainers to teach the sales folk how to how to sort of sharpen their saw, and they'd be inspired. They'd leave the room, and then some would apply it, some wouldn't. But it was sort of this fizzle. So I became really interested in that transference of knowledge into action. My first business post that franchise was a site called actionablebooks.com. That was all about helping individuals to translate ideas from books into action. And from there, I ran a training company, had a ton of fun, became really disillusioned when speaking with clients who gave us great feedback scores and had great knowledge retention, people saying that they remembered stuff. But the client would bring me back in to run basically the same training with basically the same people because nothing was actually changing. And that's really where Actionable as it currently exists came into action, was appreciating that there was a disconnect between what was being measured as far as success on training and culture change programs and actually moving the needle on the things that mattered to businesses. So started Actionable about 8 years ago, and again, its current format, for that express purpose of helping to translate learning into action and to do it in a way that could connect back to strategic priorities of the client. So the organization could see that the money we invested in training is actually generating the outcomes we want.
Well, a lot of the times, when people say they want to invest in change management for a program, that doesn't always translate into all the leading practices that you'd want to make sure you get the results, which is, a lot of companies recognize that this is really important because we've all seen the statistic that like 70% of transformation programs fail. And when they fail, people blame it on the change management not getting enough attention as one of the key reasons why things often can go off the rails. So what do you see as some of the key ingredients for a successful change management effort?
This is, yeah, how long is a piece of string? The There's so many components that go into it, but when I think about really the top line, there's often a missing piece in what we call the impact value chain. So this is going to sound very simplistic, and for anyone listening that's going through or driving a change program right now, I'd encourage you to think about each of the four components and just rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10. How much clarity do we have around what those things are? So here's the four links in the impact value chain. Number one, what is the strategic reason for this change initiative, right? What does the hope for future look like on the other side? That one's usually fairly well defined. Then you get this fork in the road, right? Because at that point, once you've said that's the thing we want, then people start going into the mechanics. What's the stuff we need? And often that fork is between systems and process improvements and behavior or cultural change. So we've got these two now paths running in parallel. And so I'm not a systems guy, so I'll go to the people side. But we assume that if we want to achieve new outcomes, we need people to act in new ways. That's the assumption. So what are the competencies? What are the new cultural norms, the things that we need to have really entrenched here in order to achieve that new outcome? That's the second pillar, is those cultural norms. So then the third layer becomes, and this is where most people fall off, is what are the behavioral changes that individuals need to make in order to realize those new cultural norms? Now, this can get quite complex and sort of varied depending on where they sit in the organization, but it's worth the work of identifying what those behaviors are. Because in our experience, only once those behaviors are identified should we be looking at the content, i.e., the training, the collateral that's being shared with learners. Because the content is not necessarily about the overarching objective. That's nice at the surface level. But what the individuals really need is to understand how to engage in the behaviors that the organization needs them to change and why it matters to them. We need knowledge and motivation for people to want to shift those behaviors. So those four pieces, what are the strategic priorities? What are the cultural norms? What are the individual behaviors? And what is the content that's going to shift that? All four of those pieces need to be thought out before we really get into any implementation work. And that's the four components that I see as being most critical there.
I couldn't agree more. You and I are like two peas in a pod on this. That in fact, the name of the podcast, the Culture and CX Connection, right? The CX and Culture Connection actually is all about bringing this all together. I like to think of culture as being about bringing not just skills to the table, but the behaviors, the relationship networks, the mindsets. You need all of those to shift. And a lot of change management efforts, I think, over-rotate on mindsets and skills. Those are both very important, but if you just focus on preaching at people and telling them why the change is going to occur, you have all the communication, all the town halls, all the stakeholder meetings, but if you don't shift the behavior, then it doesn't matter, right? So the mindsets is important, but it's not enough. And the skills are important, but it should be combined with the behaviors. And what I find really interesting about Actionable is the emphasis on making commitments and kind of using that as a way to reinforce behavior change. Could you elaborate on why commitments are so important for behavior evolution?
Absolutely. Well, I think yes, and I'm so glad you hit on mindset and skills being the pieces that get the emphasis, because I think that's right, that we do need to focus on what are the skills that need to be developed and what's the mindset that needs to shift. But then we also need to appreciate that skills are only developed and mindsets are only shifted when we engage in different behaviors, right? We're not living in the matrix. We can't just plug in and learn kung fu, right? Like we need to practice these things, which is really what we're talking about when we're talking about behavioral shift. It's the daily practice of those behaviors that leads to a different mindset, leads to sort of unconscious competence around certain skill sets. So behaviors are the most critical, and in order for us to really shift those behaviors, we need to get locked in on what does that actually mean in the context of my very busy schedule and all of the competing priorities and status quo and all the reasons not to actually change. Anyone listening to this podcast, I'm sure, has been around the block. You've witnessed, maybe you've helped design training programs, culture change programs inside an organization. And when they're done well, you get people at the end of those sessions that legitimately, genuinely make these declarations to change, right? I'm going to be a better leader. I'm going to be more focused on deliverable timelines. I'm going to whatever. And they mean it when they say it. Let's remove cynicism. Let's assume that they actually mean it when they say it. Great. The challenge is you don't do better leader, right? That's the thing I said I'm going to do when I leave. I'm going to be a better leader. It's like, great, but that's an outcome, not a daily practice, not a behavior change. So what we find one of the most common missing pieces is we need to drill down into the daily practice, boots on the ground level, to say, what does being a better leader look like to you on a daily basis? Any book with the title Habits in it, written in the last 15 years, uses BJ Fogg's work where he talks about some variation of a trigger, a current habit, a new habit, and a reward, right? And so we want to actually put it into that language. The commitments that we ask people to make when they are inspired, when the knowledge is fresh, needs to be structured in a way that sets them up for success. And that structure is, when this happens, instead of doing this thing, I will do this new thing because, and here's the reason why it matters to me. It sounds kind of pedantic. It sounds, like you're being too micromanagey on it. It's not. This is actually helping people to hit the ground running, right? So that.
But you're creating a habit building loop,
Yeah.
and you're allowing people to act their way into new mindsets. So they're gonna learn these new behaviors. So to put this into kind of context for the audience, you're bringing a lot of content out there as part of a change program, and you're exposing people in the organization. A lot of this socialization of content to stakeholders is a process of taking the content you build up as part of, like Chris said, where you want to go, what, the how, the why, what are you doing? And you're sharing content with people to motivate and inspire them to change and be part of the change. And you're building a movement. I like to think of it as building a movement to drive change in the organization, where you're enrolling more people. And what Chris is talking about is at those key moments that matter in your own company's change journey, because you're on a journey too. When you get people excited about some of this content, those are really attractive opportunities to get them to make commitments. So be very intentional about who you're engaging, what you're engaging them on, what's the sequence of how you do that, and actually spend the time to actually identify what the behaviors are you want and how they're going to change and what commitments you want people to make. Yeah. Foster those conversations in the right way, surface the content, get people to make commitments, and watch the magic happens. What happens after people make commitments, Chris? What happens next?
Yeah, so then change is hard. So you make a great commitment, and then you leave the proverbial room and you get back to work. And the first time you try something new, you're not as good at it as the way you did it previously, which is a point of risk, right? I tend to think of it, the analogy for me always is around building a bonfire, right? That this culture change is a bonfire, and each individual is a tiny little spark happening at the beginning. If we don't nurture that, if we don't, sort of breathe life into it, if we don't feed it more, wood, it's going to snuff out very, very quickly. Once it gets going, it's very hard to put out. But, at that early days, it's at high risk. And so people will attempt to practice the thing that they committed to practicing. Because again, most people want to do good for themselves, their team, their organization. And a lot of them will run into challenge. Having a feedback mechanism by which you can identify days after the session who is actually getting some early wins that can be nurtured and shared, who's struggling a little bit that can be sort of laser focused coaching from the right people around them, and those trend lines across the organization to say, well, maybe we've got systemic challenges here. Not, to your point, at the end of the year when we're analyzing that 70% of the change initiatives failed, but literally days after, weeks after, we need to breathe life on that flame and help it grow. And so it's really important in our experience that the individual has a way to measure their own progress, to see gains before it shows up on KPIs or even is observable to their colleagues. We need visibility for managers to be able to know who to coach and when around these mission critical strategic changes. And we need visibility for the organization to be able to see as holistically and as trends where things are going off the rails, where we thought we communicated it clearly but need to double down, where are the bright spots that we can shine a light on. So for us, what happens after is high risk. And that's where we need to be putting the most attention, not on what's happening in the room, but what happens right after they leave the room.
So it sounds like what you're emphasizing is the kind of continuing to sustain focus on the change and not treat it as a one-time exercise of stakeholder engagement. It's not just an opportunity to engage stakeholders and get them to make commitments, as important as that is. Again, it's just like mindsets is only part of it. Behaviors are what matters. And if we really want to emphasize the behavior change, we have to stick at it, which requires ongoing conversations and feedback. You don't go to the gym once and become a world-class athlete. You have to continue to practice and get feedback along the way and coaching along the way on your journey. Otherwise, you won't make the same progress. So the same thing's true at a company. Change is an ongoing process, and we want to engage people along their journey and give them feedback. So the ability to solicit that feedback and track and be able to have visibility into people's motivation and commitment to change and whether they're putting the commitments into practice is key to your change management efforts.
Yeah, and celebrate the wins, right? Anytime you have a group of humans, you're going to have the bell curve of humanity. And so you're going to have people that are just totally checked out right after the session, or maybe didn't even go to the session. And those are areas to focus on, obviously. But as importantly is the other end of the spectrum, those people that are really creating some massive breakthroughs early on in the process. We want to celebrate those. We want to share them back, not just to keep those people motivated, but to normalize change, right? To share through the organization that I appreciate you're struggling right now. There's some others who aren't, and here's some tips on what they've gained that may benefit you. Having that feedback loop, right? So there is that constant sense of we're in this together. We are collectively making change happen, even if I'm not, or I've got a manager who's a blocker, but I know that the organization is shifting and that makes me feel good and recommitted or ongoingly committed to the change process.
So I've shared this with you, and I've shared it with the audience, but for those who haven't heard this before, I'm going to share it again, which is JourneySpark Consulting's name is a layered metaphor. Your customer's on a journey, your company is on a journey, and your employees are on a journey. And what Chris and I are talking about right now is how to be more intentional about the journey your company's on, and think about those moments that matter in your company's journey, and also the learning journey of your employees. And how can we celebrate the wins? How can we identify the key moments in the journey where we want people to make commitments? How can we continue to get feedback across the journey? So Actionable is a platform that allows you to generate not only a better workflow for how you manage change, but a feedback mechanism to gather info. So it's not just a way to surface the content and track who's engaged in the content and to surface the right commitments and behaviors, but it's a way to actually track who's engaging and get 360-degree feedback. Chris, could you share maybe an example for how this has worked in practice? What's a great story about work you're proud of how you used Actionable to drive a larger scale change program?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, there's I try to remove identifying information here for the purposes of our clients. But there's a consumer packaged goods brand that had about 12 years ago invested fairly heavily with the usual suspects, big four consulting firms around solving this business problem where the employee experience and the customer experience varied radically depending on where you interacted with them. They're a multinational organization, and depending on which country you were in or which store you were in, you would have a very different experience. And so they wanted to normalize that, and they wanted to obviously move the average up. And so they'd spent all the money to identify what the sort of core values were that they needed to live by. They then blasted those out through the organization in what I would consider to be a traditional top-down approach to change, right? 1% of the organization has deep understanding of this based on the work they did with Big Four. And now we're communicating that through in packets of information to the organization. And we've got very colorful and well-designed collateral, and it goes out and everyone's read it or seen it and nothing changed. Like literally sort of fractions of decimal point movement in the stores. And so when they engaged with the consultant that Actionable was working with, they understood that that hadn't worked. They wanted to double down on this. And so what they did was they started over effectively. Same content, didn't do the analysis again, but said, let's do a kickoff event, CEO talking head town hall. We'll redo that. But then immediately following, in the weeks following that CEO town hall, each team inside the organization, so literally tens of thousands of teams, would have a 1 hour discussion with their team where they would talk about not the what of the change, but the so what and the now what. They worked from the assumption that everyone had seen the CEO town hall because that was their homework to do so. People came into the calls or the meetings and they spent 45 minutes saying, okay, so what? CEO's not here. Should we care about this? Does this even matter to us and where we sit in the organization? And giving people time and space to actually turn that over. That contextual layer, that piece around, does this matter to me? Should this occupy brain space? Am I motivated enough to break inertia? Is the most critical component of the change initiative in our experience. And I appreciate that. As a tech company, I'm talking about something completely non-technical. This is humans talking about the thing, right? To say, does this matter? Because what we have found is that when given the time and space to have that conversation where it's not about pushing more content, it's not about content at all. It's about us and why that might matter if it matters. Most people do. We saw 86% of people across the organization that participate in those conversations going, yeah, this matters to me. And so then they make a commitment to a daily practice, one small shift that they're going to make that moves them closer to that hoped for future. Matt, going back to your point earlier, change doesn't happen in a workshop. Change doesn't happen in a month. This is a year, multi-year process, right? To truly change the culture of an organization. And that organization appreciated that on the second hop. So they have a conversation with their team. They make a commitment to daily practice. They use Actionable's technology to keep themselves on track with that commitment and for visibility to now start to populate across the org. Managers can see who's working on what and provide coaching for them. The organization can see that out of our 4 values, this one has 72% of people's attention at the beginning. Interesting. Why? Being able to dig into where's the bright spot. And as we go into next quarter, let's pick one of the other 3 that we maybe want to revisit and double down on a little bit more, create a little more collateral around so that there's a little bit more reason for people to want to lean into that second one and repeat. So over that period of time, they saw a 32% increase in the bottom performing stores in their both net promoter score and employee net promoter score to actually move the needle up on that. As importantly, they started to build a catalog of best practices from their top performing stores to be able to create a really targeted catalog of solution points to the pains that were being identified by some of those lower performing stores. So it becomes an iterative process over time, right, as they go through that process and works towards the real change that they want to make.
What you're highlighting is that there's not just a process or process, depending on, again, which side of the border you're on, but I've worked with plenty of Canadians, and I can speak process or process fluently. There's a lot of ongoing insights that you want to generate, not just to feed your teams to work on this, but also to see how the things are working on your change efforts. And what's interesting is that a lot of the measurement that goes into programs or multi-year transformation efforts, a lot of it is upfront insights, or then trying to measure the impact, the financial impact you're having, or adoption statistics, but not enough is going into measurement of adoption of the behaviors and the changes you want. So, and a lot of the change management kind of insights are very rudimentary, just basic interviews or surveys that are used to guide the change efforts. And Actionable provides a very, very robust set of tools to enable you not only to get people to adopt those commitments, but to provide ongoing insights about your change effort itself. It's actually insights about the journey. So you talked about NPS. Having the ability to measure, and get constant feedback from your customers is important. And a lot of what companies do to get feedback from their employees is just an annual engagement survey, or it's ad hoc research that they do as part of their change effort. You're providing a much more systematic approach to listening to the program itself.
And they link, right? That's the key bit for me, was that being able to see in that particular client case, they had their own internal employee net promoter score, and seeing a positive move was great. Being able to work backwards to what behaviors were those people working on, or were their managers working on 3, 6, 9 months ago? And is there a correlation there where we can see that this behavioral shift at a supervisory level leads to a 10-point gain for frontline employees, for example, right? Again, I'm always careful with correlation versus causation, but when we see that happening enough, the client goes, well, we should really focus on teaching those skills or those behaviors in our new manager training program. Like, great. So now it becomes an embedded part of their ongoing process.
Chris, one of the things that I found often is really effective is to link these change efforts to a cornerstone discipline like quality management or enterprise agility or data science and adoption of AI or human-centered design or something like that, because then it's more like skiing downhill. There's already commitment and people are already building skills and they're already applying them. So by linking your CX and EX efforts to one of these cornerstone disciplines, it's easier to build momentum in your movement. And what you're describing is a way to amplify and make that process more successful. What do you see as some of the leading practices to use this to build on those other existing, disciplines in the company?
That's a great question. I think for me, this comes down to how we're selling the importance of the program that we're driving internally, right? One, selling it in the true sense of securing budget for it, but then as importantly, selling it around increasing stakeholder buy-in, ideally from as many people at the very top of the organization as possible, so that you can activate them to activate their folks. Aside from the specifics of what you've just talked about with the cornerstones, which I want to come right back to, one of the things that I preach regularly, one of the hills that I will die on, is that any people development program should have a clear commercial impact associated with it. Meaning, there should be ability to say, if we fix this the way that I want to, or if this program has the success that I want it to, it will improve this financial metric by X, showing an ROI of 3X, 10X, whatever. It's amazing to me how many people development programs don't have that baked into their initial positioning, even if it's hypothetical, just to have it baked in. Because to me, it's every other function in the organization is presenting the business case through that lens. And yet, so many people programs, whether it's culture or leadership development or training of any kind, don't. It's pulling from a discretionary budget that gets hacked or shrunk during recessionary times or global pandemics. So why do we have ourselves beholden to this budget that fluctuates month to month or year to year? We should be focused on the commercials. Now, one of the shortcuts to this is to link it to one of the cornerstones that's already being sort of adopted and really embedded by the senior leadership team. Because assumedly, if agile is a thing that we are moving forward as an organization, someone has crunched the numbers to say this matters from a financial standpoint. If we do this well, it'll do this. So if you can link to an existing, not only are you sort of piggybacking on the commercial link that's already been established, but you're also likely engendering yourself to an internal champion, the person that brought Agile in the first place. You're now able to hopefully leverage that sort of halo effect for them to also be a champion of your CX program.
So to bring the CX and culture together, there's two, it's like a Reese's cup, two great tastes that go great together, right? So the on the CX side, the company needs to focus on a path to value. But also like they have a vision of their CX. They understand how this is going to create a deeper emotional connection with their customer, and they understand how this is going to create a path to value, and they're generating regular insights to inform those efforts to, better, faster, cheaper, path to value, and they're able to measure value realization. On the other side of that, Reese's cup is the culture and change management, where you're trying to reinforce the motivation and commitment to change and drive the behavior adoption that enables you to make faster progress on your CX initiatives. And if you don't have both sides of that, it's suboptimal. If you don't have the focus on value, then you're not going to generate as much impact. But by the same token, if you don't have the motivation, commitment to change with the right behavior adoption, then your people are just going to be spinning their wheels.
That's totally agreed. And I think just building off that example, if we're suggesting that this culture change program is going to expedite the process of realizing our CX vision, that's the business case, right? We want to be able to show how this culture change is going to help us achieve our CX vision 6 months earlier, which means that all the clients signed in those last 6 months should have an increased lifetime value or whatever the thing might be of X. That's the value. And then that should have a multiple ROI effect on the actual investment in the culture change program in the first place.
So how much content do you need to surface to people before you can get them to make commitments? When your experience, there's lots of content you can develop as part of a CX effort. What's the right sweet spot for, having content to engage people, and what are the right ways to have these conversations that share that content?
As little as possible, and typically far, far, far less than what you're currently doing is the somewhat cheeky short answer. If we think about it,
snackable content, it's really easy to digest.
Yeah, it's thinking back to what's the point of the content. The point of the content is to trigger desired behavior changes, desired as mapped out to achieve the strategic priority. So that behavior change needs content to do two things. It needs to explain to people how to change so they understand the mechanics of it, and then we need to give them enough space and enough reasons for reflection for them to want to change. I need to know how to change. I need to want to change. And it's more that, right? I see it as, well, not I see it, the data is very clear that it's actually the ratio between content and context that matters. Content's fine, and if you need to give people lots of content, okay, the specifics vary, but we need to give them on average 3 to 5 times the amount of time, calendared time, to dig into the so what of the content as it takes them to actually consume and digest the content.
So we're actually really focusing on catalyzing conversations. It's about catalyzing those conversations is more important than digesting volumes of content.
Yeah, if you ask them to watch a 2 hour webinar from the CEO explaining the change, you need to allow them 6 to 10 hours of real time to unpack that 2 hour webinar in order to maximize the likelihood that they'll achieve that they'll apply it. And that doesn't happen in one shot either, right? It's got to happen sort of spaced out because people can only change one thing at a time as they move forward. So that's why the change inevitably takes, a year instead of the month that we want to sheep dip people into the content.
This brings us back to this point of being intentional about designing your change journey.
Yep.
What are the steps you're going to go through? And don't just go off in the cave, do the work, and come back and share it with the people in the organization and have it as a comms effort and expect change to take off. Actually create an intentional plan for how you're going to have the right set of conversations spaced out with the right time in between them, and give people a chance to make commitments and act on them and give feedback, versus treating this as a project that goes off and comes up with a document that you then communicate to people. That's not going to drive change.
Nope. It's also going to be misleading, right? Because you don't know exactly how it's going to land in the organization until you land it in the organization. So the idea of mapping your process, I keep using the word, for sure, for the next 12 months, sort of block and tackle, right? Like, here's the spaces with which, or the frequency with which people will be meeting to discuss. But I think it's a fool's errand to be mapping the content for month 9 when you're in month 1. The first 3 months of content being shared and watching how people are applying it, where they're getting stuck, best practices coming out, that will in many ways inform or certainly impact what you're sharing in the next 3 months and the next 3 months. So we used Agile as the example before, but it is very much an Agile approach to the culture change that's taking place.
For our audience, Actionable is providing a software platform and a set of leading practices that are woven into the workflow of the platform for how you can leverage content, conversations, commitments, and then tracking of insights with dashboards to power your change efforts. That is incomplete without your CX strategy, without a map for your change efforts and a roadmap, without the content that you're going to feed into the system, and without the behaviors and commitments you want people to make. So the batteries that you need to include are these other things around the content and the behaviors and the change strategy. And that's why we have a partnership here where I'm focusing on the content and helping be the guide on the journey, and leveraging Actionable as a platform so it's more automated, and some of the best practices for change management are baked into the process.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I love working with groups like JourneySpark and you specifically, Matt. We get inbound requests all the time around the app. It's like, well, can you give me the Nudge app? And we've basically got to a place of nope. Like, sorry, what? You're a nudge technology company. I'm like, we're not. We're a change system. And I loved your example with sort of batteries not included. That's the critical piece, right? Is there needs to be people thinking strategically about what are we trying to achieve, working through that impact mapping chain, impact value chain, and then engaged in the monitoring of. It's not a set it and forget it, because culture change is not a set it and forget it.
If people want to learn more about Actionable, maybe you want to share your website again, or any other suggestions of things that they could do to learn more about your company and your ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. So actionable.co. I'll share with you, Matt, as well, and then you can share as appropriate. We've got every year we do an analysis of the key elements leading to most successful change and consistent change. So I've got the 2023 paper, depending on when you listen to this, The 2023 paper is around achieving impact certainty, we've come to call it, where we can drive a high degree of probability that the change will happen and where in the organization. So that's a great place to start. If you go to actionable.co, it's under the free resources section, Achieving Impact Certainty Annual Report.
Thanks very much, Chris. You can see that on the screen now, and feel free to reach out to either of us. Chris, is the best way for folks to get a hold of you LinkedIn or your email? What would you recommend for people?
Sure. Yeah, I'm on all the usual places. And you can just go to actionable.co as well and probably direct you to the right person to talk to too.
Fantastic. Well, it's been a wonderful conversation. I've really enjoyed, as always, talking about ways to drive CX and culture together. And Actionable is a platform that I'm committed to using, and I hope our audience gets a lot of value out of it as well. And if you'd like to talk about how this can help accelerate your change efforts, feel free to reach out to either of us, and we'd be happy to talk to you about how it can help you on your own journey to be more customer driven. Thanks again, Chris.
Thanks, Matt. Great to see you again.